think the European Union has gone mad. You know, it has completely messed up its own vaccine procurement and its own vaccine rollout. It's failing on all fronts. It was too slow. It's dragged its feet. It's not helping its own people in the way that it said it would.
Well, strong sentiments here being brought across by Brendan O'Neill, editor of the British platform Spiked Online and a veteran Eurosceptic. To my mind, this view that the EU, in some way or another, messed up its vaccination programme quite substantially is a fairly commonly held view. However, as is evidenced by O'Neill's comments, criticisms of the EU are often fairly simplistic. Perhaps you will agree with me that all that O'Neill really says in that clip is the EU did bad, and they were too slow. Now, this deficiency in these criticisms is something I want to address in this video. I'm going to split this video into two main parts. In the first part, we shall see that the malaise of the European vaccine rollout has to do with its problems with the pharmaceutical concern AstraZeneca. We will look at this case in a fair amount of detail. In the second part, we're going to look at more generic criticisms of the EU's handling of the crisis, which will cover a discussion of whether the right policy aims were pursued by the EU. The EU Commission invested in a diverse range of vaccines to ensure that their supply is secured to the greatest extent possible. However, as many vaccines are not yet available, more reliance was placed on the two regulatory approved ones, those being BioNTech Pfizer and AstraZeneca. AstraZeneca has the advantage that it does not rely on experimental mRNA technology and has fewer logistical difficulties, such as not relying on freezing temperatures to be transported. It's also a lot cheaper to purchase. In addition to these benefits, in August 2020, the EU Commission entered into an APA, or Advanced Purchase Agreement, to allow member states to purchase 300 million doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine. These high numbers of apparent availability meant that the AstraZeneca vaccine became an integral part of the EU's vaccine drive. In August 2020, €336 million were paid as part of the APA to ease AstraZeneca's ability to manufacture the vaccines. As we saw, the vaccine was then approved in December 2020 by the European Medicines Agency, and in January 2021, the vaccine rollout began. We can see then why relying on AstraZeneca was a very attractive proposition. You have a vaccine that is easy to administer, cheap, and also apparently readily available. So far so good, but very soon after this, at the beginning of February 2021, a dispute arose between the EU and AstraZeneca because AstraZeneca was not delivering the agreed amount of doses, leading to a 61% cut in deliveries, which obviously, since the EU was really heavily reliant on this vaccine, threw off their vaccine targets quite significantly. This failure to deliver was down to production difficulties on the part of AstraZeneca at a European plant. So to provide a brief summary, what we have here is the EU negotiating with AstraZeneca to get access to a certain number of doses, paying money to them to do so, and then AstraZeneca failing to deliver the promised amount. Putting it like this, it's fairly clear that the mere fact of AstraZeneca falling behind in deliveries does not mean that this is a failure necessarily of the EU's vaccine policy. If we are to argue that the EU vaccine policy failed, we need to discover if EU decisions or policy choices failed to prevent or increased somehow the likelihood of such a thing happening, i.e. the problem with deliveries. The question is then, who made the bad decisions that led to the EU vaccine programme failing? We must look further into why AstraZeneca fell behind on deliveries, which is where the commonly made claim that the EU was too slow to agree on a contract comes in. AstraZeneca's CEO Pascal Soriot claimed that because the UK government started working with AstraZeneca at an earlier date, they could sort out supply chain teething issues. This period of time was missing in the EU's case. The counter-argument, or counterclaim to this, is that the EU was not too slow in working with AstraZeneca.
AstraZeneca-Vertrag der Europäischen Union ist einen Tag vor dem von Großbritannien unterzeichnet worden.
So what Merkel says is that the EU signed the contract with AstraZeneca a day before the UK, which is indeed true. The EU signed it on the 27th of August 2020, whereas the UK did on the 28th. So much for the EU being too slow then, right? Well, no, because it assumes that the date the contract was signed is the only date of importance. It's also true that the British government reached an agreement in May 2020 with the pharmaceutical company. Furthermore, the British government was previously working with Oxford University behind the development of the vaccine much earlier, which could have further facilitated an elimination of the logistical difficulties at an earlier point, which is something Soriot talks about in his La Repubblica interview. But does this mean that the EU was too slow? We could say that much of the advantage that the British government had here could be attributed to having perhaps we can call it a native advantage, in the sense that the vaccine was developed nationally. So it makes it easier for the UK government to arrange supplies and logistics at an earlier point. For me, there is another big question here though. Given the knowledge of these teething issues on the part of AstraZeneca, which they must have known when they signed the contract with the EU, given that they needed those 3 months before the contract, according to the CEO, to get things working, why then were these high numbers for delivery agreed with the EU Commission? I'm also assuming that the EU is more difficult to deliver than the UK, simply because the EU is larger and thus you have to produce more, so I'm assuming more can go wrong. This is in fact something that Merkel also hints at in her interview.
Die EU hat über 400 Millionen Einwohner. Wir haben hier, das dauert länger.
Surely the AstraZeneca negotiators must have known something about their capacity to deliver, and this being challenging to attain, given that these difficulties existed in the British case, but could well be multiplied as deliveries had to be scaled up for Europe. I think this has some rather important implications on who screwed up here, and there are, to me, some questions that should be answered. Were the EU negotiators informed about these teething issues in logistics? Was there any information on the likelihood of difficulties which existed in the British case and may well be more likely to arise in the European case, given larger scale and thus difficulty of operation? If so, why did the Commission publicise the delivery schedule they did, assuring European citizens that they would be vaccinated by summer? If the Commission officials were not informed, then why did AstraZeneca not act transparently? Was the Commission naive to accept their assessment in any case, should they not have known that delivery could prove to be quite difficult? Without having been privy to the negotiations between the two, we really have no way of knowing. But looking at the incentives here, we can clearly say that the Commission has quite a big interest in more vaccines being available. It would demonstrate that they are competent political actors and that the EU in general is capable of delivering results beneficial to all Europeans, something that may be questioned due to its performance in recent years. So in other words, the more vaccines produced and delivered, the better for the Commission. AstraZeneca's motivation would generally be to sell more to make more profit. But this does not apply here because the operation with the EU is not for profit. So there isn't necessarily that much self-interest at stake here. Selling more doesn't obviously benefit them. So to my mind, it's more likely that the Commission either treated these difficulties with naivety, or perhaps they didn't think that these production limitations would really come into effect, which again I think can be called fairly naive. In any case, the cut in deliveries took place and had severe consequences for the EU to meet its vaccine targets. The Commission officials attempted to remedy this situation by requesting that AstraZeneca divert its production from its UK facilities in order to make up for the shortfall in EU production. According to the EU, UK productions were producing on schedule. The argument was then that vaccine doses that were available to distribute to the EU by AstraZeneca, and in order for AstraZeneca to fulfill its contractual commitments, AstraZeneca should distribute from these UK plants to meet the EU's demand. AstraZeneca refused, to which I will get into briefly. I do wonder at this point, though, why the EU Commission negotiating team did not make any contractual arrangements for such a situation taking place. Even if we assume that the Commission was not familiar with the difficulties that AstraZeneca faced, it's surely possible to foresee that logistical issues would happen. The Commission accepts that a wide portfolio of vaccine delivery is needed to ensure supply, but surely the same can be said about supply chains generally. You don't want to rely on one factory supplying things, since if this fails, then you are in a bad spot, which is sort of what happened here. Surely this is something you want to avoid, which probably can be done contractually. Ideally, as we shall see, in English law. Returning to the refusal of AstraZeneca to allow the EU to access these UK-produced vaccines, CEO Soriot gave two main arguments for the failure for AstraZeneca to perform, which were, again, speed. We've already generally covered this argument, which was that the British government probably secured its supply before the EU. To my mind, however, the contracts that are negotiated are more important here, because these create legally binding obligations, at which point the EU was faster to negotiate. Equally, the Commission's answer to this is, so what? Even assuming that the UK started earlier, does that mean that the EU 27 nations are not entitled to any vaccine produced in the UK? I don't think so, and I think that's a fairly reasonable argument by the Commission. The second reason used by AstraZeneca to justify their failure to reroute vaccines produced in England to the EU is that they never committed to supplying a particular number of doses to the European Union. I think this is a very odd claim. We know that there is a contract that says AstraZeneca must deliver a certain amount of doses to the EU. But Soriot's argument is based on the APA with the EU, which contains a best reasonable efforts clause. This basically states that AstraZeneca does not have an absolute obligation to deliver the vaccines, but rather the obligation is to do their best effort to deliver the amount as set out in the APA. Soriot claims that this means AstraZeneca did not commit to Europe. I think this is a bit of a misstatement of the actual situation. If we read the contract as a whole, we know that there is a commitment to deliver the agreed number of vaccines, a task for which AstraZeneca must use its best reasonable efforts. From what I understand, this means that AstraZeneca must deliver the doses using its best reasonable efforts. If it fails to deliver despite its best reasonable efforts, then this is not a breach of contract. We know that AstraZeneca's deliveries fell behind because of production difficulties. This is perfectly consistent with AstraZeneca's commitments. Deliveries can go wrong even if we commit to our best reasonable efforts. But recall that the Commission asked for a transfer of vaccines produced in Britain to the EU. Is this excluded by that clause? I don't think so. I understand that there was a commitment to Europe, but a disclaimer on certain grounds that AstraZeneca would not be bound to the contract if its best reasonable efforts are used, but even with this, delivery was not possible. It does not say that AstraZeneca can refuse to deliver from its UK plants to Europe under the contract with the EU. This is a view shared by Professor Gareth Davies on the LSE blog, who argues that if the Commission brought a case against AstraZeneca, it may well succeed under Belgian law, which is what the contract was agreed under. So why has the Commission not done this so far? The real problem here for the Commission is what would happen in such a scenario. Obviously, there's the point that winning in court is not guaranteed. Second, even if it's successful before the court, Belgian law allows the remedies of termination of contract or specific performance. Termination is not desirable because then the EU gets no vaccines at all. Specific performance means that the court forces the company to comply with what the contract says, which means that they are forced to deliver the vaccine supplies which are available and give them to the EU, which would presumably also cover those produced in Britain. But you can see the problem with this. How would a Belgian court compel the authorities in Britain to confiscate vaccines and give them to the EU? I don't think that's a very realistic situation, which is why I said earlier that the EU probably should have agreed such measures under English law so they could get an easier access to the products produced in England as a safety measure, but they did not do this. I also think the more fundamental point here is, what difference would it have made to the EU's general vaccine response? How many vaccines would have been rerouted from the UK to the EU? I can't really imagine that these would have been sufficient to make an impact in Europe. It also seems that AstraZeneca is struggling to meet the UK's supply from the plants that they're producing from. So again, this raises the question of whether there would really be anything left for the EU. Not very much, I think, is the answer. The only option left for the EU decision makers is then to restrict exports of vaccines for companies that are not complying with their contractual obligations to the EU. The trouble is that if this is implemented, they run the risk of undermining contracts agreed between pharmaceutical companies and other countries. Also, it could lead to reprisals from other nations, which is why there's been quite a lot of hesitation to push these through. Concluding this section then, I think we can't escape the impression that the situation was approached with too much naivety. Commission President von der Leyen's statement that they were too optimistic about being able to produce a sufficient amount of vaccines is, to my mind, part of the core problem here. I think the Commission overstated how many vaccines would be available and are now paying the price for setting unrealistic targets. I don't think they paid enough attention to the possibility of production shortfalls and thought that it would, rather naively, all turn out well. They also did not attempt to secure contractually any way to secure supplies from Britain, which got them into quite a bit of trouble. We now look at some of the criticisms of the EU's general vaccine approach. The first of these is what I would like to refer to as the global distribution approach of the EU. Despite the EU getting bad press through the attempts to ban exports, as we can see here,
and so it's lashing out as a consequence of that. It's lashing out against Brexit Britain. It's lashing out against other countries around the world by threatening to deprive them of the vaccines that they ordered. And it could have an impact on the developing world as well.
This is, generally speaking, not true at all. Europe, according to the Commission's statistics, continues to be one of the largest exporters of vaccines in the world, where they export about a third of produced doses, which, for instance, the UK has hugely benefited from. Had the EU kept all its vaccines, it has been suggested that they would have been able to vaccinate a greater proportion of their population than the UK, even with the significant delivery shortages from AstraZeneca. This leads to two possible conclusions. One argument, made by the generally very Europhile Guy Verhofstadt, is that the Commission had contracted poorly and thus lost out on a great part of the vaccine doses produced inside the European Union. On this view, it was the Commission's negligence that made these doses be subject to exports. The alternative view here is that this great number of exports has actually been intentional, an argument I find personally more convincing. According to Gareth Davies, allowing exports has been a deliberate move by the EU policymakers that recognises regional and global commitments to combat COVID-19. These commitments would be undermined by preventing exports from taking place, as is the case with countries that have taken a nation-first approach, such as the US. In other words, it seeks to ensure that vaccine nationalism does not take place and the rest of the world does not fall too far behind more wealthy nations. On this view, then, vaccine shortage is not solely a consequence of poor EU decision-making. Rather, it's the result of a conscious EU policy not to solely look after its own interests, but to consider those more widely of the globe too. This particular perspective can also be criticized. One normative argument that can be made is that a state should look after its own interests first. This argument was made by Norbert Röttgen, a German MP of Chancellor Merkel's ruling CDU party.
Ich finde, wir haben es auch ein bisschen übertrieben mit dem moralischen Imperativ kein Impfstoffnationalismus.
For those of you that did not see my subtitles, the argument is basically that a democratic nation should prioritize the health and well-being of its citizens at all costs. This is the moral duty of a government, and allowing vaccine exports to other nations to the extent that it undermines the ability of a government to provide for its own nation is not compatible with such a moral requirement. Of course, the flip side of this is that we do end up with fewer vaccines going to other countries, including other EU countries. This makes the argument rather difficult to make in the European case. If we accept that the EU is a community that is based on some degree of solidarity between its member states, then wealthy states like Germany taking all the vaccines is simply not acceptable, something which I covered at length in last week's video. With a unilateral national approach taking place, leaving aside the difficulties this entailed, which again I discussed last week, I can also easily imagine that there would have been calls for the EU to take stronger actions, and nevertheless a third course could have been taken, which is to have a common European approach for procurement, but to ensure that the vaccine produced in the EU doesn't leave the EU, and to use all available funds to ensure Europe maximizes its own supply before that of anyone else. It's fairly clear, I think, that this was not done, as the EU itself prides itself that it is the largest exporter of vaccines in the world. Now, this is something you can see as a good thing or a bad thing, but it can definitely be a criticism of the EU's approach. By failing to secure most of the domestic European production, the Commission has put itself under a lot of political pressure, and to some extent undermined the idea of it being a competent political actor. Now we shall look at a number of other criticisms of the EU's vaccine rollout. One common argument is that the EU did not spend enough money on the initial vaccine push. Comparisons are made with the US, which spent huge sums of money in Operation Warp Speed, which was around $20 billion to roll out vaccines as soon as possible. This did not happen in the EU, where only 300 million were spent. Perhaps spending more money could have avoided production shortages like those currently available with AstraZeneca, but this is a counterfactual situation, so we don't really know. And as we know, vaccine production isn't really the EU's biggest problem. A further criticism made is that the EU had the wrong negotiation priorities by looking to bring down the price of vaccines. The EU pays much less on average for vaccines in most cases than other countries, which you can see from this table taken from the Washington Post. This approach has been criticized, as is argued by Wolfgang Münchau, given the high cost of the pandemic and how much global economies are losing every day because of lockdowns. Lower prices for vaccine aren't really relevant compared to what is lost every day by the economies, if it comes at the cost of speed and security in vaccine acquisition. It's also been suggested by other commentators who claim that lower prices mean disincentives for delivery when more than one deliverable client exists. This means, in essence, the more you pay, the greater your chance of getting a delivery on time is. This may apply for some pharmaceutical companies such as BioNTech, which appears to use different levels of pricing. On the other hand, as we saw, comments by AstraZeneca CEO Pascal Soriot suggest that AstraZeneca are not operating for profit, and that the EU's falling behind the UK was because the UK simply started working with the company at a much earlier date. But is it wrong to look for low prices? One of the goals of the EU is to make affordable vaccines. We also need to ask why the goal of low prices was pursued. Münchau places blame on the EU, claiming that institutional characteristics gave it the wrong priorities. But is that convincing? Could these goals not have been placed by member states who wanted cheaper access to vaccines? Perhaps they didn't think there was a trade-off between speed and low prices. Also, as I discussed last week, one of the advantages of joint European action was to keep prices for the vaccines down. So perhaps this doesn't really have anything to do with an unwillingness to pay more. Rather, it stems from the lack of competition between the different EU states, as well as their combined great purchase power. So, to conclude things, is there one decision we can look at and say the EU totally messed up? I don't think so, which is why I think many journalists are really quite vague about claiming what the EU did wrong. To my mind, what went wrong is as follows. Firstly, with regard to AstraZeneca, I think insufficient heed was paid to the possibility of production difficulties existing. I think confidence on the part of the EU Commission might have been too high, and too little regard was paid to gaining alternative access to vaccines if the arrangements failed. But again, much also depends on how transparent AstraZeneca would have been during the negotiations. Regarding the questions of cost, I don't think this is altogether determinative. As we know, EU countries are quite capable of producing vaccines capable of covering quite a significant amount of their population. The trouble is that much of this was exported, including to Britain. Why this happened is open to interpretation, and this may well be a cost issue. The EU didn't want to pay very much, so the producers went elsewhere. But to me, the most convincing is that too much was allowed to be exported because of the moral concern of vaccine nationalism. Whilst this is a morally worthy consideration, it places the EU in a difficult situation, having lost much political credibility as a political actor, as well as reducing the welfare of its own citizens. If the EU is to have a strong future in Europe, it must also be to the benefit of people living across the continent. Failing to focus on their welfare may well have done much damage to the EU in the long run, and I think that is the main problem with its current vaccine policy.